Many thanks for staying with us here on Newsdesk. Now, part of the Greater Accra and Central regions and their surrounding areas have experienced earth tremors, the phenomenon which took place at about 10:40 p.m. Wednesday, June 24, 2020, occurred 3 times in the space of 10 minutes. Some residents of Osu, Ablekuma, Mahi, and Kaneshi, Achimota, Adenta, Circle, Kukumlemle, right here, Accra, Newtown, Legon, Dansoman, Kaswaha, Chukwashiman, Teshinungwa, McCarthy Hill especially, among others, said they felt the movements. Now, some Ghanaians have also taken to social media to share their experience on this tremor. We'll bring that to you shortly. However, what is the history behind these tremors and what are the implications for structural development? We're going to have a conversation with Dr. Ishmael Norman. He is an analyst with some experience as far as security and risk development is concerned. Thank you very much, Dr. Norman, for joining us here on Newsdesk. If you can just help us with a little bit of education on earth tremors. Definitely, there's a distinction between earthquakes and earth tremors, and we hardly experience earthquakes here in Ghana. But if you can help us with the history of tremors here in Ghana.
Good morning. The country's exposure to earthquake, it's not as strong as places like in the Middle East.
Okay.
Because on the probabilistic seismic map of Africa and Middle East, the ground acceleration for earthquake will not exceed 10% in a 50-year period. That is good news. It tells us that our exposure is not as strong. However, a tremor is just an aspect of earthquake, even though it's not as strong. So earthquake is, by its name, is a shaking of the earth. And a tremor is also a shaking of the earth. So it's a mini earthquake, if I may put it that way. But we call them tremors because they don't last for long.
Very well.
Right. Yesterday, I experienced in the Kokrobite area, because I live right on the beach, I experienced about 4, even though some people counted. That means that there was an aftershock after the 3rd one.
Okay. Okay, so perhaps we had only 3. The 4th one could be an aftershock.
Yeah.
I was right here in the office and I experienced 3 of those, tremors. But can you help us? Just about a few weeks ago in Mexico, in Brazil, and in those areas, they have experienced earthquakes, and there seem to be pockets of these happening all over the world. Is that something happening that we should be aware of?
In fact, when we look at the world map yesterday, there were over 472 tremors or earthquakes yesterday alone in the world. And so we have to worry, because some of the experts have predicted, Ghanaian experts, have predicted that that Ghana is overdue for a big earthquake. And this prediction has been going on year to year. And so when we have these kinds of events back to back, like we did yesterday, it is very concerning. However, this is not to cause fear and panic. You remember January 17, 2010, there was an earthquake hoax, and people ran out of their homes and they were on the streets, even though, and they used the U.S. Aeronautical Authority and then BBC as a source of incoming earthquake, which was not true, because nobody can predict earthquake. So we have to be very, very careful not to scare ourselves to the point where we cannot act. Because believe me, we cannot have COVID-19 and in the midst of COVID-19 also earthquake. So we have to be very careful. Even though Ghana has had very serious earthquakes in the last 400 years, dating back as far back as 1800s, 1858, 1863, 1883, and so on and so forth. And each one of them had its own level of scare and also a little bit of fatality. The strongest one was the 1939 earthquake where people actually lost their lives. So we have to be very careful not to scare ourselves.
Seeing that this is not something you can predict, and we want to avoid double tragedy because we're dealing with a pandemic already, and already we have structural issues with flooding and all of that. Can you help us to identify some of the areas that are prone to earthquakes here in Ghana, and what we can do structurally to help ourselves should we encounter this?
Well, here in Ghana, the entire coastal line, and there are people in far away as Kumasi that felt this. So we cannot limit it only to the coastal line. But Accra, particularly the Weja area, is a very vulnerable area. However, again, if we build our houses in response to the vulnerability that we are facing, it should give no cause for alarm, because California is even more vulnerable to earthquakes than we are, and they have very serious earthquakes. But because they know their vulnerability level, their exposure level to the risk of earthquake, they are building houses and high rises to respond to major earthquake up to about 7.5 magnitude on the Richter scale. So we can do the same, except that we haven't done the same. And our building stock, there is a greater fear that about 50% of buildings that were built before 1995 have a greater level of exposure to earthquake damage and fatalities.
That is very interesting, and I'm wondering what advice you would give to people who are living in. Would you say that they should begin to relocate, or that they should have some structural adjustments? Is that possible, and would that be a better option, seeing that it's not easy to relocate people here in Ghana?
Relocation is out of the question, because where are we going to go? We cannot create another Ghana somewhere in the middle of the sea. So that's out of the question. What we need to do, and I hate to say this, but I think government itself has to help homeowners, and this discussion always comes up when there is a tremor, when there is a serious one, that homeowners may be assisted with soft loans to retrofit their houses. Because if you are not living in a well-structured, confined masonry housing, your exposure, even in the city of Accra, or even in Kumasi, or even in Nkoko, is very, very high. And so the government has to come with modalities. NADMO attempted in 2011 to come out with building construction regulations. And many engineers were attacking NADMO for doing that because they said NADMO doesn't have the mandate to do that. But I think it was a bit of short-sightedness on the part of the engineers, because that is the part of the mandate, the general mandate of NADMO, to make sure that people are prepared for emergencies of all kinds, and not just flooding, not just earthquake, but all kinds. So I think if we can revisit and really go forward to enforcing that regulation that NADMO came out with, the building code of NADMO, it will help. Because the LI we were using, it was a very bad LI 16 something. I am not in the house, so I can't refer to any of it. It was a very bad thing, you know, and because they said Ghana buildings should be in accordance to building regulations in Britain. Ghana is not Britain. The geotechnical makeup of our soil, of our land, is not the same as in Britain. Even that of Accra, the geotechnical makeup of the land in Accra is different from that of Kumasi or that of even Weja. You know, so
Dr. Norman, I'm wondering
about these things.
As you talk about the nature of the buildings we have here, I'm wondering if you've had a look at the building code that was launched recently by the Minister for Works and Housing and the Vice President, which will guide, structures that will be coming up, subsequently. I wonder if you've had a look at it and whether it addresses this issue.
I haven't actually read it because I haven't had access to a copy, even though I have looked for a copy. So I will look for a copy again and see whether it will be available. Sometimes when they launch these kind of regulations, they have to make it available to the public so that we can all study it and inform ourselves of what to come. So I will take a look at it. But if it is based upon LI 1630, that will be a horrible thing.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Dr. Ishmael Norman is president of the Institute for Security and Emergency Studies. He joined us with some thoughts on the tremor that we experienced last night around 10:40 p.m. About 3 on the average, so for some people 4. Well, Dr. Ishmael Norman says that could be the aftermath of the third one. And so if you experience that, it is not an earthquake, it is a tremor, and we need to prepare as a country for this.